I sold your house to pay for a vacation for me and my husband. Pack your things and get lost. The words hit the air like a punch I didn't see coming. I was standing in the living room, the late afternoon sun slicing through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Everything about the house, the familiar creak of the staircase, the worn edges of the kitchen counters, the smell of polished wood spoke of decades of life, of memories, of family. And yet, in that moment, it all seemed irrelevant to her. She spoke with the authority of someone convinced they held the world in their hands. Yet blind to the truth right under her nose, her husband stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding like her pronouncement was gospel. They were sure they had cornered me, that I had no leverage, no recourse, no options. They had prepared this moment, rehearsed it down to the exact words, timed it perfectly to coincide with their so-called victory. And yet, I smiled, quietly, calmly, not out of mockery, not out of anger, but from a deep understanding that the real control had never been theirs to wield. "You need to pack your things," she said. Her tone sharp, commanding, almost shaking with self-satisfaction. "The house is gone. I paid for it all. The vacation. Your possessions. Get out." Her eyes sparkled with triumph, and her husband's smirk widened. They had built a fortress of arrogance, convinced it was impenetrable. And for a heartbeat, I let them enjoy it, because patience was part of the plan. I walked slowly across the room, letting each step fill the silence she had created. I didn't look angry. I didn't argue. My hands remained relaxed at my sides, my posture steady. I let the tension build naturally, letting the weight of her certainty press against the calm I carried. She mistook my silence for hesitation. She mistook my composure for weakness. But she was wrong. Every misstep she had made, every arrogant assumption, was already being undone by forces she hadn't even considered. "What's so funny?" she snapped suddenly, breaking the fragile moment of silence. "This isn't a joke. I've already sold the house. You don't even have anywhere to go." I let her words hang in the room, heavy with certainty, while I simply smiled, small, knowing. I walked past the furniture, brushing a hand lightly over a familiar countertop, then stopped and turned slowly toward her. "You don't need to worry about me leaving," I said softly. My voice was calm, deliberate, and measured. "Or about the house." Her confident facade faltered, just a flicker at first, but enough to notice. Her husband's posture shifted, subtle tension replacing the smug assurance that had been so evident moments before. Confusion flickered in their eyes as they tried to read me, to anticipate the next move, only to realize that the script they had written for this confrontation no longer applied. "You? What do you mean?" she stammered, stepping back instinctively. "I paid for everything. The house, the vacation," I said. I interrupted gently, my calm smile unwavering. "The house was already sold." Her jaw dropped, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of a chair for balance. Shock, disbelief, panic, creeping in where arrogance had once been. Her husband's eyes widened in horror. They had both assumed that control was theirs, that I would react with anger or desperation. They had assumed everything. And now the truth unfolded like a slow-motion revelation. The house was gone, their leverage meaningless, and their victory non-existent. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Shadows stretched across the floor, as if acknowledging the shift in power, in reality. She would never forget this moment. Every detail, the quiet confidence in my voice, the calm patience of my stance, the inevitability of truth would linger in her memory for the rest of her life. Not humiliation, not anger, not shame. It was the quiet revelation that arrogance, when untempered by foresight, always collapses under its own weight. And I smiled again. Small and knowing, letting the lesson settle. Timing, patience, and quiet foresight had accomplished what confrontation never could. She thought she had the upper hand. She thought she controlled everything. But she was about to learn, in the most unforgettable way, that the real power had always been in my hands. The room was still for a heartbeat after my words settled in. My daughter's face had gone pale, her confident expression crumbling under the weight of the truth. Her husband's smug grin vanished almost instantly, replaced by confusion, then rising panic. They had assumed total control, believed they had cornered me, and yet now everything they had planned, every calculated move, was meaningless. The house was gone. Their leverage dissolved before their eyes, leaving nothing but exposed arrogance. She blinked, trying to force her confidence back, her lips pressing tightly together. "But that's impossible," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite the defiance she tried to project. I paid for everything. The house. The vacation. You can't." I let her stumble over her words. I didn't need to speak again. The silence was enough. Patience had already done the work. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, hands relaxed at my sides, letting her words hang in the air. Her panic deepened. She glanced at her husband for reassurance, but he had none to give. He was realizing, just as she was, that they had misjudged everything. "You're acting as if you control the situation," I said finally. My voice calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of experience. "But you never did." I paused, letting the words sink in. "Everything you thought you owned, everything you thought gave you power over me, it was already gone." Her knees almost buckled, but she caught herself, gripping the edge of the counter. "No, that's not true. I just, she swallowed hard, unable to complete her thought. Panic and shame were mingling in her eyes, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the sudden exposure. Her husband stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation, his voice rising in frustration. "We can work this out. You can't just—" I held up a hand, cutting him off. My tone was soft but carried authority. "No, there's nothing to work out. The house is gone. The transaction completed weeks ago. The decisions you thought gave you control were meaningless. And your attempt to humiliate me, to dictate my life, has only revealed your arrogance." The realization hit them both fully. Their expressions shifted, moving from anger to disbelief to dawning horror. They had assumed power, assumed I would react with outrage or panic, assumed I was dependent on what they believed they controlled. They had been wrong. Completely wrong. I could see the wheels turning in their minds. My daughter's eyes flicked nervously around the room. Guests had started to notice something unusual, a tension that didn't belong in a celebratory space. Whispers began to spread. Some guests craned their necks to catch snippets of conversation. Others exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The aura of control my daughter had assumed was now evaporating in front of witnesses. Her voice trembled now. "But you can't. What about the vacation? The plans we made?" She was grasping at straws, desperate to reclaim some semblance of authority. Her husband shook his head quickly, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find words that could undo the situation. But none came. I smiled again. Quietly measured, letting the truth speak for itself. Plans are temporary. Power built on arrogance and assumption is fleeting. What you thought was yours to control was never under your control in the first place. The room seemed to contract, the air thick with tension. Every detail was magnified. The polished floors, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, the faint hum of distant traffic outside. All of it contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions contained within that single living room. Shame, panic, confusion, disbelief, all reflected clearly in their expressions. Guests now fully noticed the shift. Some whispered, leaning closer to see what had happened. Some watched silently, eyes wide. The energy in the room had transformed from casual celebration to something charged, almost cinematic in its intensity. What had begun as a simple declaration of arrogance had transformed into a quiet reckoning, and everyone present could feel it. Her husband's face had gone pale. My daughter's voice cracked again as she stammered, You mean everything I said? Everything I did?" I stepped closer, my voice soft but carrying authority. "Everything you assumed gave you power was a lie. You acted as if my life depended on your decisions, as if you held the cards. But the truth doesn't bend to arrogance. You will remember this moment. Not because of anger, not because of punishment, but because reality has a way of teaching lessons more enduring than any words of warning." She staggered back slightly, her hands gripping a chair for support. Her husband took a step forward, as if to argue, but paused, realizing fully that resistance was futile. He had miscalculated. She had miscalculated. Their assumed victory had been obliterated quietly, without theatrics, by timing, patience, and calm foresight. I turned slowly, gesturing toward the sunlight streaming through the window. The house was sold. The transaction complete. My life continues. What you thought was leverage was nothing more than an illusion. For the next several minutes, neither of them spoke. The tension hung like a heavy curtain in the room. My smile never wavered. They had underestimated me. They had assumed weakness where there was patience, arrogance where there was composure. And in that quiet reckoning, I realized, sometimes the most powerful victories come not from confrontation or anger, but from knowing when to wait, when to observe, and when to let the truth reveal itself fully. By the time they finally recovered enough to speak, the lesson had already sunk in. Guests whispered in hushed tones, some glancing my way with curiosity and subtle respect. My daughter would never forget this day. Her husband would never forget it. And neither would anyone else who saw arrogance confronted with quiet, unshakable authority. In that moment, I understood fully. Life doesn't require dramatic revenge. Timing, patience, and foresight achieve far more. And today, quietly, deliberately, I had won not through anger, but through the undeniable power of truth. The room was thick with tension, as if the air itself had tightened around my daughter and her husband. Their sense of control had evaporated in the span of a few calm sentences, replaced with disbelief, panic, and the slow, creeping realization that everything they had assumed about me and about the house was wrong. They had walked in thinking they held the upper hand. Now they were grasping at nothing, their carefully built facade crumbling piece by piece. My daughter's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the counter. The color drained from her face. Her husband's jaw tightened, his confident posture faltering. They both kept glancing at me, searching for anger, a sign of desperation, or any crack in my composure. But there was nothing to find. I stood there, calm, deliberate, my presence steady, as if the chaos around them had no effect on me. That calm only deepened their unease. You can't just," she stammered, voice shaking. "I paid for everything. The vacation, my plans. How can this be?" I shook my head slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. Silence has a weight that anger cannot match. It forces people to confront the reality of their assumptions. "It's already done," I said quietly. "The house was sold weeks ago. Everything you thought you controlled was never yours to command." Her husband stepped forward, attempting to regain some semblance of authority, but his words faltered under the weight of truth. We can fix this. There must be something we can do." I looked at him directly, calm and unwavering. "No, there's nothing to fix. You acted as if you had power. You acted as if you could dictate my life. But power built on arrogance and assumption never lasts. Your plans, your threats, your declarations, they mean nothing when the foundation is false." The realization hit them both fully. Their faces shifted from shock to horror. They had believed they were clever, that they had outmaneuvered me. Every step they took to assert dominance now felt futile. Their plans to humiliate me, to force me out, had collapsed without confrontation, without argument, without drama. The victory they expected had been quietly stripped from them. My daughter's shoulders slumped. The defiance that had shone in her eyes moments ago was replaced by a stunned vulnerability. Her husband's arms fell to his sides, the mask of confidence gone. For the first time, they saw me not as someone to belittle, but as a force steady, unshaken, and untouchable by arrogance or assumption. Guests had begun to notice. Whispers spread across the room, curious glances exchanged. Some watched openly, while others pretended not to see, but no one could ignore the charged atmosphere. The shift in power was palpable, almost cinematic in its intensity. The confrontation was not loud or dramatic, it didn't need to be. The quiet authority of truth had done what threats and insults could never achieve. You sold it? My daughter whispered, almost to herself. Her voice trembled. You weeks ago? I nodded slowly, still composed. Yes, the sale was finalized. All decisions you thought gave you leverage were meaningless. Everything you believed gave you control was an illusion. Her husband ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of helplessness, frustration, and dawning understanding. We underestimated you, he admitted, voice low, almost defeated. Yes, I said simply. You did. The weight of that simple acknowledgement hung in the air. The lesson was clear, unavoidable, and permanent. They had assumed arrogance would carry them through, that they could dictate outcomes, that they could humiliate someone they believed powerless. They had miscalculated. And in doing so, they had revealed the truth, that patience, foresight, and calm authority outweigh threats, manipulation, and pride every single time. My daughter's expression broke further. She finally realized that control is never guaranteed, that power built on assumption is fragile, and that trying to dominate others will always carry consequences. Her husband's jaw tightened again, the lesson sinking in fully. They had been outmaneuvered without confrontation, without anger, and without drama. The quiet truth had spoken, and it spoke louder than any of their boasts ever could. I stepped back slightly, giving them space to process. My smile remained calm, steady, measured. There was no gloating, no triumph, just quiet authority, the kind that comes from knowing the truth and having time on your side. They had tried to trap me, belittle me, force me into submission. And yet, here I stood, untouched by their schemes. Entirely free from the control they thought they possessed. The room continued its background hum of activity. But the energy in this corner had irrevocably shifted. My daughter would never forget the sting of her miscalculation. Her husband would carry the realization that arrogance and assumption are dangerous companions. And my presence, calm and deliberate, had delivered the lesson with perfect subtlety. Patience and foresight can dismantle even the most confident attempts at control. As I looked at them, I understood the truth clearly. Victory does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is subtle. Sometimes it is simply a matter of waiting until the world reveals the reality that arrogance tried to obscure. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, they learned a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. The tension lingered for a few more moments, then slowly began to dissolve as reality settled in. My daughter's shoulders sagged, her defiance replaced by stunned recognition. Her husband stood silently beside her, finally understanding that their sense of control had been a mirage, and that the calm authority I carried was not something they could challenge or manipulate. The house was gone. Their plans were meaningless, and a quiet lesson had been delivered. I took a step back, letting them absorb the weight of the situation. There was no need for anger, no need for shouting, no need for confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice is simply timing, patience, and clarity. I smiled gently, calm and unshaken, as they processed their mistake. I could see the realization dawn in their eyes and understanding that arrogance and assumption never triumph over foresight and composure. My son entered the room at that moment, hesitant but observant. He glanced from his sister to me, noticing the calm confidence that radiated from my posture. He understood, in that quiet moment, the depth of the lesson unfolding before him. Respect and dignity are earned, not demanded. Arrogance and entitlement can crumble instantly when faced with patience, knowledge, and quiet authority. She tried to speak again, but her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reclaim. The truth had been revealed so thoroughly that her attempts now only emphasized her mistake. I simply nodded, acknowledging the lesson had been received. Later, as the day continued and the house faded from immediate concern, I reflected on what had occurred. Life doesn't require revenge to be effective. Justice doesn't always need anger to carry it forward. Sometimes it arrives quietly, naturally, through patience, foresight, and the calm certainty of knowing the truth. My daughter and her husband would remember this day forever, not as a moment of victory, but as a humbling lesson in perspective, respect, and consequences. And I realized that sometimes the strongest victories aren't loud or dramatic, they are quiet, measured, and undeniable. Because in the end, the house may have been sold, but my dignity, my calm, and the quiet power of truth remained completely intact. And that is the lesson worth remembering.